A very warm welcome to everybody in the room, to the Marshall Institute, and a particularly warm welcome to everybody online who's joining us here in London. My name is Jonathan Roberts, and I'm a professor of civil society and public policy here at the Marshall Institute. And today we're going to be exploring approaches to social justice in philanthropy. I'm really honoured and delighted to be joined by two absolute experts in this area. On my immediate left is Swatee Deepak. Swatee is a leading thinker, activist, entrepreneur in this area. She's a visiting fellow here at the Marshall Institute, and she currently works with all sorts of private and public foundations, family offices, wealthy individuals, to improve and design their philanthropy. She's also the founding member of several collectives working across philanthropy and social justice. She is co-chair of the Global Fund for Children and an advisory member of the L'Oreal Fund for Women. So, Swatee, a very warm welcome. I'm also very delighted to introduce Priya Gupta. Priya is a coach, facilitator, and anti-racism trainer. She's got a remarkable track record. She's been an economist at the Bank of England, head of policy at Save the Children, chief of staff at a huge affordable housing provider. It's quite an extraordinary story. And now she and her husband are philanthropists as well, and particularly philanthropists in this field of social justice philanthropy, which we're going to be discussing tonight. So a very warm welcome, Priya. Let me just explain what the structure is going to be of this event. The motivator for this event was a chapter that Swatee and I wrote for the Handbook of Philanthropy and Social Policy, in which we sought to begin to analyse this emerging and extraordinary field of social justice philanthropy. So I'm going to very briefly introduce some of our analysis as a first step. And then I'm going to ask Swatee and Priya to respond to that. And in particular, tell us how it really is in the real world, because this is both a powerful and emerging movement, but at the same time, it's under a lot of fearsome pressure because of ill winds, I would say, in the political environment that we have around the world at the moment. So we'll have some time to discuss those issues. And then at the end, we will leave 15 or 20 minutes for questions from the room, but also from those of you online. So if you'd like to ask a question online, please put it in chat, and one of our colleagues here at the Marshall Institute will raise the questions at the appropriate time. Okay, so on to my brief introduction about social justice philanthropy. It's, of course, a contested term, social justice itself, and I couldn't resist but bring up one of the great intellectuals of LSE's past, which is the economist Friedrich Hayek. Hayek, of course, said that social justice is a mirage. And he didn't just say that, and I had some fun looking this up. He also said that social justice meant nothing at all. It's a vacuous concept, it's empty and meaningless, it's a quasi-religious belief with no content whatsoever, a primitive anthropomorphism, and my very favourite one, a hollow incantation like open sesame. So it's fair to say that Hayek didn't really think much of socialism. I'm pleased to say, for the sake of this event, that Priya and I Swatee and I do think that there is something in this phrase, social justice. But nonetheless, the idea of social justice, philanthropy is ambiguous, it is contested, it is used indiscriminately. So the point of our chapter was to try and bring some order to this term, social justice philanthropy. So as academics and as practitioners, we could begin to analyse it fully. So let's take a look. Get these slides. There we go. So what we did initially was to try and create some sort of framework of social justice philanthropy. And the starting point is here. Now, what I want you to see is a progression of steps in this diagram, but they're not steps of chronology or time. They are steps of radicalism. And in particular, radicalism, we would say, on the progressive side of the political spectrum. So the starting point is some sort of focus on equity and justice is implied by social justice. We're thinking of the works of the philosopher John Rawls and so on. And we're trying to do something good for the most disadvantaged in our communities, in our world. And the next step is to focus on root causes. In other words, if there's some sort of disease or disadvantage relating from poverty, we don't simply treat the disease. We actually go back to the root causes within poverty, within medicine, whatever it is, to actually try and solve this so it never happens again. So it's, first of all, those two things. And some people might stop there and say that's enough for social justice. But we then move to a third dimension, and we're beginning to become rather more strong in our perception of social justice here. And that third is about power. It's saying, yes, we're trying to solve the root causes, but the root cause is the inequitable distribution of power in our society, whether that's power attached to material resources, power attached to cultural resources, whatever it might be. So we've got this fundamental definition going on, and that might immediately separate out certain approaches of philanthropy. So if we're thinking we can use certain market-based approaches to philanthropy, which is increasingly popular, they wouldn't necessarily see power as the key issue that is problematic in our societies. So then we move to the next and further progression, more radical progression, which is we really act on this and try and ameliorate and redistribute the power in our society. So even though we diagnose the power as a problem, we don't always necessarily feel that we need to attack the structural problems. So we could invoke something like the Gates Foundation here, which is doing, I think, a great job in tackling gender inequality, but within existing power structures. So when we talk about financial inclusion of women, we're still including people in the existing financial structures of capitalism. But the more powerful step is to say, well, there's something wrong with capitalism, or we need to use philanthropy to, in some sense, disrupt the existing social arrangements. So that's where Swatee and I were thinking the most powerful, strongest representation of social justice philanthropy might lie. We're leaving it up to people to think where they define and place social justice in this sort of continuum, but we're thinking the most powerful arrangements are at this fourth level. But this fourth level also carries one other necessary consequence, and that is that you challenge the whole essence of philanthropy itself. Because if we are assuming that power is at the root of social problems, and if we're assuming we want to tackle the structural reasons around that, then the huge accumulation of wealth, which enables much elite philanthropy to happen, therefore that also has to be challenged. And what also has to be challenged is the giving of resources and grants by the wealthy to the disadvantaged, because that is an exercise of power. So there are big challenges, therefore, if we are taking social justice really in this strong version, about how we do philanthropy and whether certain kinds of philanthropy are in the end unacceptable. So that's a broad view of our framework, and we would love your comments about whether it works for you, whether it's, you can use it for your own analysis. I just wanted to quickly touch on a couple of other things that we sought to begin an analysis of. And the first of those was, who does this strong form of social justice philanthropy? And we identified a number of categories of actor. The first one was community-led action. So this is where a particular oppressed group in our societies, whether it's by race, by gender, by sexuality, and so on, they're actually accumulating resources themselves and distributing those resources. They become the grant givers. So there are a couple of examples on the screen there. So the Australia Fund, for instance, which works in the area of lesbian rights, has just distributed about $40 million over a period of about 50 years. So on the one hand, that's a lot of money. On the other hand, that's pretty tiny compared to what a lot of big philanthropy does. But that's the idea of community-led philanthropy. We also spotted what we're calling new wave philanthropy, which is in particular when people, young people who've inherited money, are choosing to set up a foundation explicitly committed to social justice. One of those is the Gorilla Foundation, which is funding social movements which seek to address oppression in our societies. The third and perhaps slightly more contested area is when you see mainstream organizations like the Gates Foundation, like the Ford Foundation, apparently switching some of their practice to engage in the strong form foundation, a strong form social justice. And whether you think this is truly social justice or philanthropy or not may well depend on your particular perspective, your particular ideology. When Gates does gender equality work, when the Ford Foundation does its, I think, admirable films which are trying to change the normative debate around disadvantage and colour and so on in the States, do we think that is foundations just following a particular trend, or are they really genuine about this strong form social justice philanthropy, which is really seeking to undermine structures in our society? The next is a collection under the broad heading Next Generation Philanthropists. So this is particularly people who are inheriting wealth, the next generation of wealth inheritors, but not always. It can be people who made their own wealth. And I've got three categories there. The first is people who are not oppressed, do not come from these communities, but who are progressive. So Abigail Disney would be an example of that, and her very public commitment that the wealthy should pay much, much more in taxes. That's a very disruptive social justice kind of position. We've also got people from marginalized communities who have, against the odds, become wealthy, who may be funding social justice philanthropy. And connected to that, we have this fascinating issue, which I think Priya might pick up on, of having multiple identities here, being both one of the elites in terms of the wealth you have, but also belonging to what is essentially an oppressed community as well, and how those multiple identities played out. And certainly I think there's a lot more academic research which could be done in that sort of area. The next thing was, why is this happening? Well, there's a long history of social justice philanthropy, but it does seem to be accelerating. There are various reasons for that, but clearly some of the particular traumas that oppressed communities have suffered over the last years, which have been very public, have given some acceleration to it. But that's also accelerated mainstream foundations want to putting money into what looks like social justice, but we maybe might question the precise motivations behind some of those transitions. The final thing I just wanted to mention was what this means for philanthropy itself. And I've got two different categories here. One is what it means for the role of philanthropy, what philanthropy is doing in our society. So the first thing there is the government becomes central, by which I mean, if you really follow this social justice logic, you have a much bigger role for government in our societies, in taxation, in services, in legislation that ensures equal rights for all, equal citizenship for all. So government is highly prominent here, but also highly controversial and contested because government is often the source of oppression for some of these communities. The next thing is plainly resourcing social movements and alternative viewpoints so that they can change policy, change structures. Holding the state and market to account. So some of these social justice philanthropists are, for instance, funding legal action against police forces which oppress communities, which use violence against communities. There's a fine example of philanthropists coming together to work for labor rights in the tomato picking industry in California. So holding the market to account for social justice. And finally, there are also interesting challenges to how we understand effectiveness in public policy, which is very cost-benefit driven, very evidence-driven. That seems like a good idea, but actually it can be very patronizing and not really take into account the objectives, the understandings of effectiveness of the oppressed communities themselves. They're coming top-down. So different views of evidence as well. So what does this mean for how we do philanthropy? Just a few brief observations finally. It is interesting to think about who makes decisions about funding and what should be funded. And an important part of social justice philanthropy is devolving everything to the user. How we give grants, so any restricted funding that comes with conditions, well, that's an exercise of power. And so too is anything like top-down targets and reporting and so on. So therefore, unrestricted grant making is much more characteristic of social justice philanthropy. Longer-term funding for disadvantaged communities, and also a switch in accountability. Who is accountable to whom? Normally, when we give a grant, we expect to receive all sorts of reports about how the grantee has used that money, but actually, let's turn it around. Perhaps the funder, the elite funder, should be held accountable by the user, by the people who are getting the grants. So that's just a brief overview of how we're beginning to think about and analyse social justice philanthropy. And now it's my great pleasure to turn first of all to Swatee to get her views on it.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. I have to say, for people who are out of like academic work and writing, it's like a real lesson in getting to co-write something with like an academic professor at LSE, because I was like, yeah, there's this idea and there's this example, and he was just like, where are all the references? And really appreciated all the rigor behind trying to put sort of pen to paper, and I really enjoyed we had quite opposing views actually all the way through, so we challenged ourselves all the way through writing this work, because I think fundamentally for me, and I do think that this is, for me, I don't believe necessarily that social justice as a term is political, because my orientation of the world is that all of us should be living in equity and freedom and liberation. Everyone should have their rights realised regardless of where they sit in society. And so because of that articulation for me of how I think the world should be, this just feels like a mechanism in order to best get us there and recognise that the societies that we currently are part of do have their own shortfallings, and for us to really have that, that's the pathway. But you know, you challenged me on that, and I'm sure others will in the room, where it comes to that sort of end point that we're all focused on. What are the societies that we ultimately want to live in? But I think what's interesting from sort of my journey within this is that, you know, for me, I really believe in the power of movements, grassroots leaders and movements of people who come together to make change happen. I think that when you look at the histories around the world, there are very little sort of examples which don't have like strong social movements as part of that big sea change, whether it's independence movements, revolution movements, changing sort of political structures. There have always been these huge movements of people, and they've taken on different roles and work. But I believe that social movements are like critical to the societies we live in. They're not the sole driving change. I still also absolutely believe that we need people doing incredible service provision in societies, providing whether it's education or healthcare access or legal aid or other elements that are necessary. And I also believe that, the power of advocacy and campaigning and so on and so forth. But I think fundamentally for me, and for a lot of the people that I work with who take a similar worldview, is that that's the sort of endpoint that they're looking at. And they also believe that in order for us to best have the impact and not leave impact on the table, we've already done, for some of the foundations I work with, they've been working for like decades, if not hundreds of years, on some of these social issues. And so they've already tried lots and lots of mechanisms to get there. And this just feels like a new one, which is actually, we've always been a bunch of white men in ivory towers making decisions about where money should go and where we should be putting it. But actually, have we tried to think about not just including people from communities within the way that we make decisions, but allowing them and their analysis to form part of the articulation of the problem as to why we continue to fail. So I think you take lots of examples where you look at, okay, well, if you take malaria prevention, there have been like absolute billions that have been put into malaria prevention around the world. And billions that have been put into programs where you are giving nets and education to people in communities to use these nets. Now, what they found with lots of that is that actually the people who were coming to receive this kind of teaching conversation from different organizations were men. They were getting the free net and, a free lunch or coffee that came with the workshop. And then they went home and they passed the net to their wife, mumbled something. And actually those nets were used a lot to like store things. They were often hung up in kitchens and people put their pots and pans there because there was no understanding of exactly like how the dynamics of power worked in the home and who was actually responsible for making sure that the children were safe, that the net was used appropriately. And actually that woman was just using it for something that was necessary in her home. So without an articulation that actually understood not just the sort of gendered dynamics that were going on in the household, but also about how power operates, that women actually didn't get to, they weren't allowed to leave their sort of villages. A lot of their confines remained in the home. So when they were running these workshops on using nets for malaria in a village that was far away, it was only men who were going because of the social access, the social mobility that they had, the fact that there was, so it became a social event that mainly men went to, and this happened over and over. So in that, you see that actually if you took even just a start of a social justice lens, it does transform the way that you even are programming, and you are using your money more effectively and you're not leaving impact on the table. I think, that's like one example. There are other ones where if you look at sort of financial access, and I know we talked about this, and there are many big funders for it that are looking at how we can get more people using financial services and products. There is a tipping point at which, you can do everything. You can have new products in the market, you can legislate better, you can get new providers in, you can get government in, you can build new spaces and centres, you can do things online. But if a lot of your systems rely on things like, who actually can register for a bank account because they actually have been registered at birth, and that is more men than women in many countries, or the fact that like in order to go you have to take a form of identification and you have to register in a village that's far away, without an articulation of like how power operates and who has access to social mobility in that society, what you're not doing is you're seeing that actually you could almost get to like a 50% penetration. You could do all the things and that might access 50%, but you're going to have a limiting factor unless you actually analyze the kind of social issues that are there. And I think for me, I see the benefits of applying a social justice approach in order to see a world in which I want to live in, which is where people are equal, and that we also recognize that we don't live in equal spaces at the moment, and there is an understanding, an analysis, an articulation, and therefore a response built around that understanding. But fundamentally, I also work with many clients who perhaps don't take the same worldview. But if they're wasting billions and they're not actually achieving their impact, then it's also about that you're leaving impact on the table by not having this analysis. And so it actually is more of a blind spot, especially if you're a large funder putting in billions. And I think that is why it's not even just the big private foundations. You can look to many of the European governments, up until quite recently, the US government, but also, you know, Canada, Mexico, many that governments that are also putting their investments into what I would term like a social justice approach, not across all their investments, but definitely in some areas where I think there is an analysis that they're not able to necessarily get the same impact level unless they understand exactly what the sort of the blind spots are that they're running up against and are leaving impact on the table.
Great, thank you. Yeah.
Oh, not sure how I follow either of those things, but thank you for the invitation. Congratulations on the chapter, which I really enjoyed. And you've teed me up for a couple of things that I would be really interested in digging a little bit deeper into. But just by way of stepping back, it's very, very helpful helpful is an understatement, to have this framework set out in the way that it has been, because I think for funders, for philanthropists, to see ourselves in something, and also to then be able to, and I'll come back to accountability later, but also to hold ourselves to account for something as well, beyond what we might aspire to or talk, kind of have a set of internal values, but actually to start to bring a rigor to our work is very, very important for ultimately for these kind of shifts that we're seeking to make in the world. So I am, very appreciative of the fact that you spent so much time putting this together. I guess the things I want to talk about are, as it relates to particularly 4 and 5 on the framework. The first is around if we're in disrupting the structural forces and the unequal distribution of power. I think there's an incredible role, a powerful role that philanthropists can play in actually leveraging the power they currently hold in order to see some long-term shifts in power. And what I mean by that, for example, is what are the risks, and I will come on to reframing risk, but what are the risks that we can take that possibly others can't take? In this current climate, for example, where we have seen a retrenchment of ODA, so overseas development assistance, and many other kind of government support resources, where is it? Of course, the scale of philanthropy is nowhere near the scale of government and private and public markets, but where is it that we can hold the line and take not just resource risks, but reputational risks, and kind of stand in these cracks that are starting to emerge in different parts of society and have courage. And I say that in an environment where we are seeing some retreat in many places. And this isn't the time to retreat. This is the time to step forward and actually take some of those risks. And I say reframing risk because what is the risk of inaction? I think that's again something that I think about a lot as it relates to what is the unequal distribution of power that I kind of sit with, and then what would be the risk of me not acting in this moment of kind of being called into action. I really appreciate you lifting up, and it's in the paper, about intersectional identity, because again, I think actually it's what for me has been very important is actually centering my identity as a woman of color of the global majority in how I redistribute resources, because my stories of redistribution come from, Kenyan, Indian origin, but they come from an environment where things were done in collectives. I understand what it means to be part of a bigger community. I understand what it means that I exist because of you and interdependence. And again, I think these are the kinds of principles and values that when we sit with these intersectional identities, we can talk about more. So then when I hear phrases like, okay, now we're going to move resources to marginalized communities and decisions are going to be made in community by community, I actually know the faces and the names and the environments in which that actually would feel real. And so rather than, and of course this is an ongoing journey because it's complicated, because, you know, how did I benefit from racialized capitalism, and also how have I been harmed by racialized capitalism? So it's complex, but it actually is like a gift almost. Like it is within, again, if we're talking about resources, one of the resources I have is the power of my identity and being able to kind of lean into that when we resource communities that, you know, we already are familiar with just from kind of our identity in this world. But I will just name maybe 2 challenges. And then, of course, you know, I know we want to make sure there's time for questions. The first challenge is the structures that exist to keep traditional forms of philanthropy in place. Those structures include, you know, the wealth industry and the ways in which people with excess wealth are encouraged to maintain that wealth, that fear is created in actually, if you do redistribute and if you do these more kind of strong forms of social justice, then here are all the many things that can go wrong. But actually, if we look at the way in which, you know, children who are born into the top 20% of the income distribution, it is highly unlikely. I mean, we would struggle to demonstrate that they will fall to lower ends of the income distribution. So by the time that, you know, we're first generation wealth, but by the time you have made your wealth and, you know, you might have a family or there are other things that you're considering, you know, the risks to you are smaller. I mean, that by definition, like the history proves that out, and our lack of social mobility proves that out. But the messaging and the systems of power that exist are telling a different narrative. And so actually there is a struggle for kind of strong form social justice philanthropists to kind of push back. And I think you mentioned it here about amending philanthropic processes to redistribute power. We kind of also need to amend other kind of financial processes that are sort of perpetuating unequal distribution of wealth and power. But then the second one and the second challenge is back to this accountability point. You know, who holds philanthropists accountable? It's an unregulated, undefined, thank you for writing the paper, undefined sector, and we get to just sort of call ourselves philanthropists. And so I think if we are going to take on the responsibility and again, step into that power in order to redistribute power and reimagine systems of change, then actually I think the call to us is to be much more transparent about what it is that we're doing. You know, whether that means being transparent about who we're funding and how we've made those decisions, how we're doing participatory grant making processes, or how are we not asking for multiple grant reports or whatever it might be, but also be transparent about, and I really appreciate you putting this up here, because a lot of conversations I'm having with my peers is also about origins of wealth. And it's also about what happened and what harm was caused in the creation of wealth that also needs repair, that also actually needs some redistribution in order to acknowledge that harm that was caused. So the who holds us to account in committing to the sort of 4s and 5s, if we say that's what we want to do, I think is a really important and open question.
Perfect.
I would just add like a few things just as you were talking as well that I think like perhaps is also of this moment is I do fundamentally agree with the need for transparency or like a streamlining or an openness with the community that you're funding. And I feel like the moment that we're in at the moment has created a lot of fear over the attachments and the connections between different funders and different grantees. And there is a fear sweeping through where people are worried about sort of like funders are worried about their security because of the connection that they have to certain grantees in the political climates around the world that they're navigating in, and vice versa. I think some of the grantees are also a bit like, we don't want to be associated with you. Like if you take, for instance, you know, the Open Society Foundation with George Soros, that is something, a debate that has been going on for years between their grantee communities and the foundation itself. But I think the political environment has shifted so much around the world, and there is so much high regulation of civil society and philanthropy in certain states, and increasingly sort of copied by others who are shifting into different kind of political climates, that there is also this worry around that sort of the connection and the transparency. So that's my only, like, I guess, challenge to that is I think that there's also something about the dialogue that you have with your communities about understanding what the shared risks are, so that you can take the view as to how transparent you are based on that kind of relationship and the connection that you have. And I also think that, you know, we talked about this in the chapter, but, you know, what are the motivations? Why does philanthropy do this or doesn't? And I think that, honestly, like, I think for some of them, it's about how do we achieve best impact. Some of it, it's about how do I sort of really work towards a vision of my world and an articulation of where I'm coming from. And I think for some of the larger foundations, there's probably a mix of some of that for the larger board's consideration that's also driven by sort of the social moment. So if I take, for instance, you know, when Me Too or the Black Lives Matters movements happened a few years ago, there was a huge uptick, and you know, we talk about it in that, but there are many studies that show like the sort of pledging and the amounts that went in from foundations into things like racial justice or into sort of ending gender-based violence did go up in that period. Conversely, now some of those movements are like contested because of the political climate, and they're sort of seen as being disruptors of the status quo in certain states or anti-states. And because of that, you can see some of the larger foundations taking that sort of role, or that they're taking public positions that step away from that association. And especially because I think, like, with a lot of social justice, it's obviously sits on the sort of progressive left of the spectrum. And so I think in right-wing states, you are seeing this sort of demonization of anything, whether it's civil society or philanthropy as a part of that, that they are saying is driving sort of left-wing sort of dissent within their states. So I do think that there are like some of the things that are changing in real time at the moment for us, where it regards to this. And I think I'm like encouraged by the fact that some of the large foundations, particularly in the US, are taking a kind of a combative stance against these sort of threats from their state as well, which I think is really interesting. There's a letter that over 100 of the largest foundations in the US signed a couple of weeks ago. It's still getting and garnering more, and you know, some of the foundations are taking their own states to court over their sort of injunctions against them. So I think that this is like a live thing that will continue and reshape, and you know, Jonathan and I finished the chapter many months, even a year ago, so the context has really changed for how relevant this is, you know, now.
I'm going to open it to questions in just one moment. So in the room, please have your question ready. Online, please do put your questions in chat. So I suppose the question is, what I'm seeing is both this we hope, short-term emergency situation where we have more authoritarian regulation in many states, and some states where we didn't anticipate it. But I want to tackle the more chronic issue which Priya brought up, which is this is an attempt to transfer power from those with power to the powerless, and yet there are all these normative constructions which prevent that, including the whole financial industry. Because when one thinks about how finance for the wealthy is constructed, it's in the incentive structure of, say, the financial institutions to keep as much assets as possible with the financial institution, to do a little bit of philanthropic advice, but not much, you know. And so I was wondering, how we go about that chronic question of how we change the whole normative structure, also all the interests of these actors for the long term.
That's a whole discussion. And maybe I can offer a few ideas, and then I'm sure you have many to. I think the first thing is, I think it's both there's a, I think about a lot of this actually in a different way in kind of the anti-racism space, which is there's sort of the individual, the institutional, and then the systemic. I think I'll start with the individual because I suppose I'm most closest to it. I think that people of wealth have power. And if we are the holders of power when it comes to our resources, then I think finding ways to stand in that power at an individual level is one step. So there are many people who have, ourselves included, have done something called an enough exercise, where you actually figure out how much is enough to live a good life,
Yep.
to call on some of our economic philosophers, and everything else that is outside of that is excess wealth, and then can then be, sort of, to use a financial term, ring fence for the process of redistribution. And I think there's an entire movement that's kind of dedicated,
which is also led by people of wealth.
Led by people of wealth, exactly, which is again important because I think it's almost as if, like you mentioned, donors of colour, I think there's almost a sense of we need to kind of organise ourselves. Because actually, back to the point about people-powered movements being the only thing that changed the world, I think that includes individuals of wealth as well as kind of organising themselves. Incidentally, you mentioned in the paper about PN UK, another Patriotic Millionaires UK, which is, another organisation, a collective of people of wealth who are self-organising for tax justice, implementation of a wealth tax and various other initiatives that would deliberately, lower that ceiling, which includes on themselves as well, wanting to pay tax. So they're kind of individual movements. I think on the institutional and the systemic, I think there is, for me, that we have enough scientific information, enough data to show that this is not a sustainable form of capitalism. So, there was a few years ago where there was a big movement because everybody was worried about stranded assets on their bank's balance sheets. I like it when I can bring my old career into this, because there was a big movement because people were concerned about stranded assets, because there was going to be a point at which, because of the global commitment to the SDGs and to climate, that these assets were going to lose their value overnight. And so there was almost a financial incentive to shift decisions, to shift actions. And I think the same is true of kind of the sort of rampant capitalism that we are experiencing today in the financial industry that sits within that. This is not a sustainable model. And so, I think, there is, and I appreciate I sound very optimistic, but I think there is some kind of, if they really truly care about shareholder value, at some point this will drop off a cliff, and it's not in 20 years' time based on the current projection. And then I did have one more point, but I can't remember it, so I shall pause there to see if you had anything else.
Well, please come back to it.
Okay, if I remember.
If you remember it.
Yeah.
I was going to say similar ones around, like, you can see that people of wealth are organising themselves in different ways. I think there are projects that you brought up, like Patriotic Millionaires, like the Enough Project. There's resource generation and resource justice that have also been doing this, and they do start at that point of, like, what is the journey of my wealth? Like, who were the what are the communities and spaces that have been extracted or exploited, and how might I try and write that? There's good ancestor movements. There's like a lot of sort of self-organizing or spaces of organizing for people of wealth. I think the other thing is that we are in a moment of, like, the great wealth transfer as well, which is I can't remember the exact figure. I think it's something like 27 trillion is passing from one generation to the next in this decade, and we're a few years into that decade. And it's the largest transfer of ultra wealth in history that's being tracked. And actually, for the first time in history, I think the projections are that 2/3 of it will go to women, young women, for the first time. And that's also because of a lot of kind of justice work. You know, like women only got access to credit in the 70s, even in the UK. So like the fact that women can even inherit that kind of amount of wealth is also a result of justice programs and civil justice around the world. But I think that that's also something that you can see even when you read the papers from the wealth management industry themselves. Their client base is changing and they have different wants of what they want their service provider to provide them with. So, and obviously there are many, many exceptions to the rule, but like what it says in the sort of global wealth report from Capgemini is that women tend to give more over their lifetime and don't see it as sort of a retirement activity. They are aligned much more to sort of justice-based work rather than sort of endowing a university or a museum or an art gallery, etc., or a school, which you can see in sort of other forms of how philanthropy is shown up. So I think there's also something about like the moment where we're in perhaps provides an opportunity for like how things could possibly shift. And I think, again, on that space, you can see because women have not had access to wealth, ultra wealth in that way before, you are seeing also networks that aren't just focused on philanthropy, but are actually focused much more on like investment and wealth management that are just exclusive networks of women organizing each other, which is them going, if you can't get what you want from like Bank X, why don't you just leave them and move to Bank Y? Like you have the power and I can coach you through as a peer of yours. And that has a different type of power. And I think there is a lot of interesting like shareholder activism that like large shareholders are also doing. There's a lot of organizing around things like Amazon or some of the large tech companies that are being stewarded by like large shareholders who are people of wealth as well. So I think there's like interesting ways that people are sort of, I guess, organizing to try and shift power in the systems. And they're also funding groups that are demanding accountability of those same systems. So there's like sort of an organizing strategy within and out.
Perfect.
Yes, and then the outcome. I think one of the outcomes, and again, you refer to it in the paper, is that I think we expect a different role for government. And we're calling on, you know, the kind of public sector to be somewhat of if we're talking about kind of structural change, we are talking about, you know, systems which are ultimately wired and rewired within our public sector and within government policy. And so including, for example, some of these grassroots movements are demanding change and accountability at the legislative level. So I think, again, you know, private actors, for example, individuals in the finance industry, notwithstanding the amazing examples that you've offered, ultimately they're working within a system of incentives that are designed in a certain way to have a certain set of outcomes. And so if we truly care about redistributing power as well, then I think we need to redesign the systems. And those redesigning of systems can really only happen at the legislative level.
We must have some questions now. So who would like to ask the first question? Yes, please.
Thank you all, and to echo Priya's point, particularly for the framework, because I now have had the epiphany that I think I'm actually a social justice funder and hadn't thought of myself in those terms before. So I'm really excited to read the chapter. I just wanted to pull out a couple of points and maybe pull them together. There were discussions very early on about whether this is a political activity. And then, of course, we've mentioned fear as well. And I suppose for me, the question of whether it's political or not is almost moot. I think for me, the question is whether the person who has the potential to be a social justice funder perceives that action to be political, and whether that then imbues them with a sense of fear, or if that creates a barrier. Because hand on heart, I know that there are very well-intentioned organisations that are perhaps funding in a highly relational and trust-based way, and on issues and areas that are very much in line with social justice philanthropy, but I think would have the fear of God put into them if they then felt that that would expose them to a level of scrutiny that they were not comfortable with. So I'm just wondering if you had any sort of comments on why it is you both sit quite differently on whether it's political or not, and perhaps shine a light on that.
Question for you, because I don't believe it's political, but you.
Okay, I'll try my best.
Jonathan
So
does.
the first thing I would say is I think your idea of the fear of foundations in this area is precisely right. There is another piece of academic work which shows how philanthropic foundations in the UK are terrified of doing anything which is seen to be political, which really limits their areas of action. Why do I think it's political? I don't think that everybody has the same vision of what a good society should be. In other words, not everybody agrees with the vision of social justice, which perhaps I might have, or which Swatee might have. And in particular, for instance, it might be much more emphasis on the responsibility of individual people from disadvantaged communities to make their own way, rather than us transferring power. And also perspectives of capitalism, which say the capitalist system opens up every opportunity for everyone. So that's why I think it's political, because not everybody agrees with this vision of social justice. I will stop there because we must have many more questions. I can talk all night, as people know. Let's have one from online.
So Manchala, who's the chair of a women's charity, is asking specifically about the model of reversing accountability between the funder and the organisation, and whether, well, first of all, if this is actually happening, and then maybe some factors that have facilitated it in the cases where you have seen it in practice.
That's a great question. So thank you. Thank you. I think the camera's there. So thank you. The first thing to say is that for me, social justice philanthropy is as much about the how as the what. And so this is about being in relationship with grantee partners, which means knowing them and them knowing me. And for me, understanding what their work is. I actually really like what you said about kind of shared risks. And okay, so how are we in this together? How, what is it? And very specifically, how do I have your back? And so, a sort of a peer of mine said, it's the moment at which someone can say no to your funding, which is when that we really do know that there is reverse accountability, because then the table has been set to be able to have that conversation. I think it's a practice. In the case of we're now getting super granular, but in the case of my relationships with my grantee partners, I think it's always just asking the question, what else can I do? How else can I be supportive of you? What else do you need? How has this funding relationship been? Like, you had to go through this process. How did that go? Should we make any changes? What could be different? So I think it's like a constant dialogue. And I also recognize that I am saying this from a position of privilege. So it's very straightforward for me to say, you should tell me when this is not working. But actually, in a world with limited resources and a sense of scarcity, I fully recognize that is not how the relationship may be felt on the other side. So I'm just naming that as a power dynamic and an important power dynamic. And I think it's a work in progress. I don't have any good examples of that happening at scale. I'd actually love to know if others do know of those examples, and perhaps others in the room and online can also share. But that's probably my insights from the kind of handful of relationships that I've had.
I would say that there's actually a lot of examples from participatory grant makers, and my own journey in participatory grant making was I was in a mood lighting. But I was at a private foundation, and we had a billionaire founder, and we're doing great trust-based philanthropy, core grants to grassroots, proximate leadership groups around the world, and then we decided to do a pooled fund alongside 9 other funders that would fund like girl-led and girl-centered groups around the world. And instead of any of us, and we were Ford Foundation, Nike Foundation, Novo Foundation, Stars, where I was, and a handful of others, all of the decisions on our money, we all pledged $1 million each, was that all the decisions were taken by adolescent girls as to where our money got distributed, which was amazing. And it's still a program that runs, all these years later. And what was really interesting in doing the participatory grant making is as soon as the money was moving in that way and it was articulated in that way, what we saw was that a lot of our grantees would tell us what kind of additional support they would want from us that wasn't just core unrestricted grants. They were saying things like, your threshold of like small groups isn't what a lot of small girl-led groups are looking like. I think you need to give grants that are much smaller, like our smaller end was sort of 15,000, our top end was like 100,000 a year. And they were like, you need to give down to 1,000. You need to give travel grants. You should give collaboration grants between each other. And those were all things that we like did in response to it. And not only that this didn't happen in my tenure there, but what was really interesting to see is that also Frida, which is the Young Feminist Fund, has been doing this sort of model of participatory grant making amongst young feminist groups around the world for like years. And what they've seen, which is really interesting, is they don't just have sort of panels of adolescent girls making decisions or young feminists making decisions. They actually have, like, if you're a grantee from sort of the Central Asia region, it will be all of the grantees in that region who make a collective decision on where that money gets distributed. But not only that, once the decisions were made and grant agreements were put out, some of the groups were just like, actually, I don't think we'll spend all of our money, so I'd prefer to put it back in the pool. And there were other groups that didn't get funded. So I think that's like a very big shift that happens, where it's like, it's maybe not exactly the same answer to the question, but I think if you look in the participatory grant maker community, there is lots of examples about where accountability is like asked back of the funder in order to change the way that they're funding, bring in new types of grant making, or even for them to be like, I don't want to take all of this money, can you redistribute, and can we suggest someone else in the pool who is this close and we would prefer they got a slice of it rather than us take it all.
Thank you. One more question.
Quick question on tax, the lovely tax. Well, clearly you're very evolved in your thinking in social justice philanthropy on tax, but what the majority of philanthropists that I speak to would say is that, A, we pay a shed load of tax already. And previously they would say, well, okay, it's a democratically elected government, whereas philanthropic money is for me to do whatever I want with it, so I sort of get it. But Jonathan said for the first time that I heard today, well, actually the government is often the oppressor of marginalised groups. So what to the argument of, actually having this money to be able to hold government and other structures to account is a really important part of philanthropic power. We don't want to pay tax. I mean, this is an excellent statement. I think that's a very powerful way of reframing it, actually, which is always giving another perspective, which is that, yes, in the systems and structures that we currently operate in, with this significant unequally distribution of power, and the fact that our existing systems do not generate this kind of world that we aspire to live in, then how are we going to utilize the resources that we have to hold the whole governments to account? Yeah, I think that is very fair. I think that the tax are small argument, if I can say it like that, it comes from a place of, well, I can't, this is what I understand. It comes from a place of two things. One, if you're giving back, then you're taking too much. That kind of philosophy, the Anand Giridharadas kind of, how resources are unequally distributed. And the second thing is, how could that additional amount of money be redistributed at scale in a way that individual philanthropists can't do, to build fairer systems that could lead to, outcome like better health, better education, a stronger civil society, all of these kind of things that the kind of government reach and government balance sheet has.
that individual philanthropists can't do. So I think that that's some of the motivation, in addition to actually, and again, actually, I think, for example, in the UK, and sorry if, you know, I recognize this is a global audience, but in the UK, they're talking about, the PM UK, not the government, is talking about a tax above 10 million of assets. So this is a very small, this is a kind of handful of people, so actually the majority of people wouldn't be affected. And I think that's also because, and the final thing I'll say, is because of the impact of extreme wealth, so actually at that very, very, very top end of the distribution, on some of the outcomes that everybody cares about, which is kind of about political stability, environmental stability, and so on and so forth. So I think you presented the argument really well, and I think these are just some of the other perspectives that folks who are kind of campaigning on the tax justice side are thinking about.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, I won't add more because I think Priya sort of articulated it really well. But I think what's really interesting is like working with a lot of philanthropists who have actually given away so much of their wealth that they don't actually have a lot of money to give, but they still have incredible political, social, or cultural capital. They can still get meetings with like heads of state because of who they are and the families they come from, not because of what's in their balance sheet anymore. And I think that's like one thing to like remember that goes back to what you were saying. And I think what Jonathan, you articulated, there are many types of capital that people with power have, and financial is one component of that. And there is still, so like if you're giving away more or paying more via tax, does that still prevent you from the other capital that you already have accumulated that no one's ever actually going to be able to take away from you? You can still enact some of the other sort of changes you want to see in society through that. But I think it's, you know, we see philanthropists across the spectrum who you know, are definitely part of patriotic millionaires or groups like that and are calling for more, and others who genuinely believe that philanthropy, private philanthropy, can do much better in certain areas than government can. And so that's the sort of position that they take. Yeah.
Thank you. I fear we are out of time. So the first thing I'm going to say is apologies to all those online who have put in questions and we haven't got to them. If you would like to continue the conversation, please send your questions to me at the Marshall Institute, and I'm very happy to have a great conversation about it. Just to say, I mean, Swatee very kindly said that it was a good experience working with me on the chapter. I wanted to reverse it and say it was an inspirational experience for me working with Swatee on the chapter. And the number of times I would come out with a great theoretical proposition and she would say, that's not quite how it is. And this is what it's about being an academic at LSE or the Marshall Institute. And I'd like to invite everybody online or in the room to please contact us with your experiences of what social justice philanthropy is really like on the front line, because this is an emerging pioneering area of research, and we want to do it as well as we can, which means we need to get to those who are right at the front line. So that's an open invitation to everybody. I'd just like to thank Priya and Swatee so much for joining us tonight. It's been extraordinary to hear your views. I've learned so much from this. Yeah, thank you all for joining us. Thank you.